Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform and encourage discourse.
Let me first throw some light on the book through the lens of a typical author and the three fundamental questions: why, what, and how. So when I look at why I chose to write the book, so I just finished writing my two-part book on contemporary Indian military history, which is India's Wars 1 and 2. And when I finished that, I was looking around for a vacant space. And within that space, also looking for an idea, because that's extremely important. If you want to resonate with readers, you've got to look for an important space. Now, when I looked around me for the last decade or so, I realized that the landscape of biographies was increasing significantly, and you had biographies of politicians, of corporate icons, of diplomats, of scientists, of film stars, of journalists, and every genre of disciplines you have. But there was not one single authentic, deeply researched biography of a military leader, right? And I said that this is a deeply vacant space that is worth exploring. Now, within that space, you need an idea. And the idea was to look at a military leader who evolved not during the pre-independence era or during immediately after independence, but somebody who evolved in military leadership over the last 4 or 5 decades. And that is typically a post-independence trained and bred military leader. Now, there were many I looked at. I looked at Admiral Arun Prakash, I looked at Air Marshal Patni, I looked at General Shami Mehta, all of them veterans of the 1971 war. But there was one thing that General Nanavatty had, which the other three that I considered didn't have, and that was a vastly recorded repertoire of writings on his entire career, right? Whereas everyone else primarily relied on their memory for coming up with an anecdotal kind of a biography, which I think does not make up for an authentic biography. And General Nanavatty was a significant resource for me when I was writing my second book, which covered conflict from 1972 to 2020. But then there was a problem. The problem was General Nanavatty decided to fade away from public life after retirement, settling down in Dehradun and engaging in very meaningful social work. And every time I approached him for permission to write a biography, he said, buzz off, absolutely no chance. And then finally I got around to convincing his family, to convince him that he had a story to tell. And now the thing is here is that as a military historian, I somehow don't much embrace the very, very academic style of military history writing. I would much rather be, along with a military historian, I'd much rather be a storyteller also. And General Nanavatty has a fantastic story to tell, and I will throw some light on that. So I pretty much zeroed in on why I wanted to write a biography and why it had to be General Nanavatty, because he represented the contemporary Indian military leader, right? And despite having missed out on the 1965 and 1971 wars for no fault of his combat experience and his combat leadership stretches across genres of conflict that generations, that my generation, the generation previous to mine, and the generation after ours have been seeing day in and day out over the last 4 decades. And therefore, he made a perfect subject for a biography. Now, what is this biography all about? Now, and I mean to say, these are the 2 books after which I decided what did I want to do. So what is the biography all about? The biography is about the making of a modern military commander. And the biography stretches across several genres of interesting storytelling narratives and an authentic part of contemporary Indian military history. For example, Nanavatty belongs to a community, the Parsis, which have punched well above their weight, particularly in the Indian Armed Forces. 3 army chiefs, several generals, air marshals and admirals, and they've punched well above their weight. So you have a chapter on his Parsi legacy, which makes for interesting reading. And then I chronologically track his career across his early baptism with the Gorkha Regiment, his experiences overseas, which he brought back and infused as learning mechanisms into the Indian Army, his short but very, very meaningful tenure in Sri Lanka as a commander of the para-commando task force, and then as the brigade commander in Siachen during a time of very intense fighting both on the northern and the central glacier, and then his command of a corps in the northeast, when the northeast was going through a period very similar to contemporary times. You had a ceasefire in Nagaland, but you had the commencement of intense and vicious insurgency and war fighting in Manipur. And then capping his career with a very eventful command of Northern Command during one of the most turbulent times in contemporary Indian military history. And why do I say most turbulent times? It was the time when the insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir had morphed into a full-fledged covert war. You had the parliament attack. You had the Indian armed forces mobilizing for Op Parakram, in which we almost went to war with Pakistan. And then we had this peacekeeping initiative, elections in Jammu and Kashmir, and then an enduring ceasefire along the line of control, which still holds today. So in short, his entire career is spanned, in those 290, 300 odd pages. And and these are some glimpses of his career. The Gorkhas on the right, Siachen Glacier on the top left, his Parsi legacy. And then you have inspecting a few captured arms when he was the divisional commander in Baramulla with George Fernandez, with whom he interacted a lot and liked him a lot. And of course, on the bottom right is a photograph at Daulat Beg Oldie looking at the expanse on the eastern Karakorums. Now let me come to how. So whenever one decides to write a biography, whether one sticks to a very, very conventional and academic-oriented biography with hundreds and hundreds of footnotes, or do you want to look at a crossover style of writing? Now, both my earlier books have been very readable because I've decided to abandon, or I've decided not to follow a purely academic style of writing, but a crossover or what I call a hybrid style of narration. And a hybrid style of narration ensures that it is well researched, academically robust, and yet it has adequate storytelling content and is a powerful narrative. And even so, I decided that I will follow that kind of a narrative for this particular book too. And then one looks at another aspect of biographies is as to how objective is the biography, right? Now, biography is written by regimental officers, by colleagues who have served with him from the same battalion, or who are infantry officers, will but naturally infuse a sense of bias into the biography. And the borderline between writing an objective biography and a hagiography is rather thin. Now, I'm neither an army officer, I'm not an infantry officer, I'm not a Gorkha, and I've not served with General Nanavatty anywhere. It's just that I found a subject who made for a fascinating biography, and that ensured a certain amount of objectivity that I managed to retain throughout the narrative. But there's one thing which was very evident while writing the biography, and this is something which makes it very difficult to write a biography of somebody who's still alive. And that is the danger of getting overwhelmed by the personality of the central subject. And let me assure you that those of you who have served with General Nanavatty, and there are a few here, and those of you who know him would agree that he was and still is an intimidating character without being intimidating or without wanting to be intimidating. His persona itself occupies center stage in terms of how he conducts himself, how sharp his memory still is, and his grasp of the basics of soldiering and leadership. So it was difficult for me to retain my objectivity, and I still recollect there were several moments while writing the biography that my wife used to tell me that, Arjun, watch out, don't get overwhelmed by General Nanavatty's personality, write the book with your feet on the ground, right? And that was a very interesting feature of this biography as to how I managed to retain objectivity, in the presence of a fairly dominating and a fairly intellectually stimulating general, even now at the age of 81. So the three central themes that run through the book are soldiering, leadership, and strategy. And all three which were very, very close to his heart. So the first fundamental thing that I asked him in an email once was that, what did soldiering mean to you? Okay. Now, instinctively, if anybody asks us what soldiering or what it means for me to be a fighter pilot, I probably will be able to reel out a few points immediately. But not General Nanavati. He said, Arjun, you've asked me a very profound question, and you'll have to give me some time to think about it as to what does soldiering actually mean to me. And this is what actually soldiering, this is what he wrote me a mail, this is what soldiering meant to him. And if you read these bullet points, you will realize that he had thought about it very, very deeply. I loved soldiering, the method, regimentation, discipline, camaraderie, challenges, and the sheer physicality of a soldier's life, much of it in the outdoors. I had no distant ambitions. All I wanted to be was a good soldier and to do every job that came my way to the best of my ability. I was more concerned with what my command or those serving under me thought of me rather than my superiors. I looked down, not up for satisfaction. Loyalty to my superiors meant doing my duty to the best of my ability and being honest with them by saying and doing what I thought was right. And professionalism means applying one's knowledge and skills according to the situation to accomplish the mission. Now, Indra Nui mentioned a very interesting thing to me in an email. And she said, Arjun, I love this soldiering part. And to me, if I break it down as somebody from the corporate domain, I look at it this way, that unless you have... So, the first element of soldiering for General Nanavati was a passion for soldiering. Now, okay. Along with the passion came that overwhelming desire to acquire the necessary skills in order to pursue your passion. And just pursuing your passion with the skills is not enough. But what you need to do is to create an ethical and value-based framework around which you can realize your passion and exercise your skills. So that, to my mind, is a universal aspect that spreads across domains and professions, right? When we look at leadership, right? So Field Marshal Bill Slim, the legendary 14th Army commander in World War II, whose book Defeat into Victory is still considered to be an iconic book on leadership, was a role model for General Nanavati. And for him, he always said that I think, for me, Field Marshal Slim's dictum of leadership, that leadership is that mixture of example, persuasion, and compulsion that makes men do what you want them to do. And in today's context, of course, it's men and women. So he was decisive in his operational instructions and gave a long rope to subordinate commanders without breathing down their necks. So when he took over his battalion, now what happens is that in the Indian Army or in the armed forces, past reputation for units are very, very important. Okay, unit ka izzat. Izzat is very important. Reputation, legacy, those are very, very important. Now, General Nanavati had a contrarian view. He said he looked at current performance versus past reputation. And he told his men and officers, it is not what we were, but what we are that counts, right? Now, a very, very patient listener, Nanavati would offer space for dissent and contrarian views and always wait till the end of a presentation before asking questions. Small things, but in today's context wherein bosses and leaders are itching to intervene during presentations and tick off presenters by saying you're not right, but this is how it should be. I think it needs a lot of self-realization to wait till the end of a presentation before you ask your questions or before you share your perspectives, your own perspectives. Now, if one looks at what's happening along our northern borders today, what he said almost 20 years ago holds good today also, in which his approach to defensive operations suggested that they must be aggressive in design and offensive in conduct. So we always associate, defensive operations in the military as something where you wait for the enemy to hit you and then you react and you respond. But defensive operations can also be proactive. It can also be offensive in nature, and that is what General Nanavati propounded. Now, another issue that he talked about, now all of you recollect what happened in Kargil. We were surprised in Kargil because the Indian Army probably did not pay adequate attention to reconnaissance and rehearsals in the mountains. And this was one thing that General Nanavati believed in plenty, that time spent on reconnaissance and rehearsals is seldom wasted. And he always suggested that, he told me many times that I believed in seeing things for myself and said that one look is worth 100 reports. He distinguished between genuine mistakes and deliberate wrongdoing through all his command tenures. He would say, "Galti 100 baar maaf, galat kaam kabhi nahi maaf." Now, make that distinction between the two. mistakes made would be forgiven, but deliberate wrongdoing would not be forgiven. And there are several examples in the book wherein I've written about mistakes that would be penalized very stringently in contemporary times or current times, where I won't use the word forgiven, but overlooked because of the context in which they were made, right? Now, one of the things that I managed during the book was to also reach out to several of his critics, which is very, very important. And couple of his critics said that, Rostum Nanavatty was obsessed with the present and he didn't have time to think about the future, right? And when I spoke to several of his contemporaries, when I spoke to several division commanders who worked with him, they offered me perspectives that didn't suggest that he was not possessed of a strategic mindset. So what he told me was, he said, look, I had no intentions of being a strategist. I'm not a strategist, right? Strategist is somebody who sits in Delhi and prognosticates about the future. But I certainly did possess, or I certainly thought about the future. And as an author, I think that is what one would call a strategic mindset. And a strategic mindset is somebody who understands the intersection of politics, culture, societal fault lines, and the complex interpersonal relationship with subordinate commanders, right? And all the other issues that are listed on the screen, which say that a strategic mindset is not developed through courses and training of instruction, but through years of reading and self-study. He was more interested in the now, as so much was going on. And of course, the last point I want to make on strategy was that in his early years of his career, particularly as a brigade commander and a division commander, he was a hawk, right? In terms of giving Pakistan a bloody nose, in terms of responding fire with fire. But as he grew in service, when he became the Northern Army commander, he evolved as more of a realist. And this aspect of realist made him understand that one of the principal objectives of military leaders is not going to war, but is war avoidance. Just as the larger picture for political leaders is to build capability but not go to war, because war avoidance is at the apex of any political course strategy. Similarly, senior military leaders today also understand this aspect, that while it's important to prepare for war, but war avoidance is as important as preparing for war. Yeah. So I will end with this slide by suggesting that he was well ahead of his times also in recognizing the importance of the gray zone, limited conflicts, and hybrid warfare. And these are the issues that he urged young officers to develop as they grew in service. Initiative and foresight. He encouraged small team operations. He was completely against what they call in the army geru chona and ceremonial trappings. Do away with all kinds of ceremonial trappings and be in the moment in a combat zone. Climate of risk-taking. He urged officers and commanders to avoid a peacetime mindset, because he said, even though we are not fighting a conventional war, but we are in an operational war zone all the time, whether it is in the Northeast or whether it is in J&K. And finally, what makes General Nanavatty an interesting leader to analyze and study is his willingness to go beyond the routine focus on threats and capabilities and walk that extra mile to nurture morale, motivation, creativity, and innovation at the grassroots level as a conduit for building operational proficiency that directly influence the conduct of war. So I think with that, I've done my bit. And I think now we can engage in a tete-a-tete with Probal, who would also offer his insights as somebody who has been with General Nanavatty at one point in time in his career. Thank you very much.
First of all, I want to congratulate you for a fabulous book, and it captures the essence, and it also leads you through the journey of his life in a very lucid manner. And you were talking about how you have addressed it. When you read it, it just rolls from page to page, and it addresses all of these areas where he served in, the personality, the various anecdotal inputs, as well as the historical references, etc. And you said that the grey zone warfare is something that he addresses. Well, I think he's one of the generals, and we can come to it at some point in the conversation. He's one of the generals who I have, after reading the book especially, I realized that he has been a general through all of these various insurgencies at different points of time in his career, as a younger leader and as a senior military leader. And he's one of the rare military leaders who has seen all of these different insurgencies.
Absolutely, Robal. But you came across him much before I came across him. Right? You were a young second lieutenant in the Uri sector when you first came across him. So, can you share with the audience your first impressions of him, how he came across, and what all did he do when he visited you?
Right. No, thank you, sir. So I am an army officer. I served in the infantry. I served in the Gurkhas, but I didn't write the book. It is him, and this is the book. But to your point, to your questions, this was 1994. I'll just give you a little context. Early 90s, insurgency in Kashmir was very different. You had the Harkatul Mujahideen, the Hizbuls, the Harkatul Ansar. Foreign terrorists were being pumped into the valley. And those days, it was a very critical period. And in that time, General Nanavatty was commanding 19th Division. And he was, so in the division, you have about 12 to 15,000 troops. And I was about 3 months old in the Indian Army, commissioned. And I was commanding, I had 2 platoons there. That was about 60, 70 troops, soldiers. So you had 60. So I was the youngest in the division, and he was the senior most, if I were to put it this way. One day, I got a call from my adjutant, Major Bipin Rawat, who later on went on to become the CDS, India's first CDS. So he said, General Nanavatty is to visit your post. I said, Arey, he chose my post of all posts because, and that was, it was a ridge jutting into Pakistan. This was Uri. And much younger. I was much younger. This is about 3 decades ago. And he decided, and there was a daunting prospect of General Nanavatty visiting. I said, okay, I'd prepared the briefings and all those, and that briefing was, sort of vetted by my adjutant, by the CO and others, and even the brigade commander gave me a call and sort of figured that, all was fine. And then you had General Nanavatty visiting. I said, okay, I had the military briefing ready and came, and he wrote about it in his book, how he always traveled self-contained. And that was very well known. He carried his rucksack, he carried his satchel, and this is, 10, 12,000 feet. He walked to the post, and this post was about 50 to 100 meters away from the Pakistani post. It was separated by a minefield. And so he came there, he heard the briefing, but that is not the story. So what happened was that he sat down, we spoke about various things. The thing is, you spoke about the fact that, he was always a daunting prospect, when we was visiting, intimidating. But, I didn't carry that baggage. I was just 3 months old, so I heard that he is very, intimidating. And you had the CO and the other officers also there when I was briefing the GOC. But it all went very well. After that, what happened was that, we sat down and we had a conversation where he didn't speak. He wanted me to speak. One of the things I carry from that time is that how good a listener he was. You wrote about it in your book. And he had come there to understand what was happening in that area. He wanted to know, the goings on, the intelligence, the information, and how well I knew the villagers, etc. I told him several. So, this was time when you had a senior leader coming and not listening to the briefing alone, but several other facets. And he was very much interested in how the troops were doing. He spoke with the troops. So it was meant to be a 30-minute conversation, went on for 2.5 hours. And I told him about how there were villagers who had, in 1948, they were youngsters and they had stories of the Pakistani raiders who had come through Uri and who are now in their 70s. So he listened very raptly to all of that. And he made notes and he went back. So, one-on-one conversations. 15 years later, I am in Bombay and he went away and went off very well, but I suppose so. It's nothing untoward happened after that. And 15 years later, I was attending the wedding of one of his colleagues' sons and in Mumbai. And that's where I met him. And I went up to him and I said, sir, we met long ago. He says, yes, in Uri. This was 15 years ago. And he must have met hundreds and thousands of people after that. But he remembered, which is something quite remarkable. Yes, so I have a question. I mean, I was listening to you, and I had a question after reading the book. All of these chapters in this book are absolutely riveting. You start, it's like a story, it's a narrative. You spoke about the crossover style. I think that it captures the essence. It reads like a narrative. I couldn't decide which is my favorite chapter. I thought I'd ask you which is yours.
So, very difficult to choose. In terms of action, the maximum action was in the Siachen, when he was commanding the Siachen brigade. In terms of contemporary relevance with what's happening in J&K, his tenure in Baramulla as the GOC of 19 Division was absolutely spot on. But for some reason, the chapter that I found to be most interesting was the chapter that I wrote on Sri Lanka. Now, why I liked Sri Lanka was that, so General Nanavatty was not a paratrooper, but General Bipin Joshi, who was the Director General of Military Operations at that time, and General Sundarji, decided that they would send General Nanavatty, who was a colonel then, as the commander of the Para-Commando Task Force in Jaffna. Now, all of you will recollect that there was a disastrous operation in the Jaffna University where a whole lot of para-commandos and Indian Army troops were literally massacred by the LTT who were waiting for them. And after that, there was a need to restructure the para-commandos. And here was this infantry officer who was sent into Jaffna sometime in August, September of 1987 to infuse a sense of method and a sense of process and a sense of professionalism into the para-commander units who were there. That is 9, 10 and 1 para. And now, for those of you who understand the para-commandos very well, they're a very close-knit bunch of troops and officers. And anyone coming from outside has to prove themselves very, very ardently with them before they are accepted as a group. When General Nanavatty got in amongst the para-commandos, the kind of operations that were planned, and one of the paratroopers, and I'll read a letter out to you, felt that his presence in Sri Lanka with the para-commandos was, to put it very mildly, electrifying. And they said that given to a daredevil approach to soldiering, you introduced a sense of method and process into the operations of the special forces. And one of the paratroopers, and I don't know whether he's here, he was supposed to be here, John Brito. So John Brito narrated an incident to me, which was the first organized attempt at nabbing Prabhakaran and his entire top leadership from a village which was close to Jaffna. That the operation did not succeed was another matter. But that operation was still under wraps, and that is an operation that it is written about in the book, which is called Operation Capricorn. And there were a couple of other operations that took place that really were fascinating. And that's the reason why I liked writing the Sri Lanka chapter the best, because it really came up with something new and something that hasn't been written about anywhere before in the lexicon of contemporary Indian military history. Now, since I'm with Sri Lanka, let me read out a letter that, and the other thing is that I mentioned to you something which I called the Nanavatty papers. So General Nanavatty had carefully preserved all kinds of papers right from 1963 onwards down to contemporary times. And I'll read you this letter, which was written to him when he retired in 2003 by a paratrooper who served with him as, he would have been a young officer, a second lieutenant like Prabal was in Uri. And this is what he wrote. And this is an officer by the name of Colonel S.S. Tinayakar. Now, Colonel Tinayakar later on rose to become a lieutenant general. But this was when he was commanding 10 para special forces, and General Nanavatty was retiring in 2003. And this is what he wrote. My dear General, I write to express immense gratitude for being a fantastic role model for myself, and I'm sure many others in our army. I have always held you in great admiration since our short association in 1988. Young, inexperienced, and given to a cavalier approach to soldiery, your professionalism was electrifying. That first impression is undying, indelible, and has remained as a perfect guide, a lodestar to follow. Lucky are those who served with you and grew with you in service. I have tried to emulate you in many ways with little success. Minor habits which add up to a great personality. Sometimes I wonder how you could hold your own in an environment so different in morals, dignity, and dedication. I must confess that you have influenced me in many ways. On the eve of your retirement, I can only thank you for being the great soldier that you are and for discharging your duties with unmatched commitment. I hope our army puts forth more like you. It inspires us to soldier on for our army and country. With every good wish and best regards, I remain yours sincerely, Tinayakar.
I had a question about this. You spoke about the various parts and the fact that he wrote it so young. From the other chapters, I mean, you could talk about the key facets that kind of reflect on his personality and bring out his personality a lot more. And at a young age, the letter, and thereafter.
I should have actually showed you that.
Yes. Yes.
So from a very young age, General Nanavatty, and this is from his course mates from the Indian Military Academy and even from school, that he was very fond of military history, right? And even at the Indian Military Academy, I believe he was always reading about Field Marshal Slim, about Field Marshal Rommel. And, this is interesting. Why this letter is very interesting is General Nanavatty joined his battalion a mere 2 weeks after the final ceasefire was declared in the India-China War of 1962, which is sometime in November 1962, the ceasefire was declared. He joined his battalion in the first or second week of December. Now, what was the battalion doing at that time? The battalion had retreated all the way from a place called Machuka, which is on the border, from Machuka and Walong, all the way down to Along. And at that time, the government of India, as all of you would recollect, was not sure whether the Chinese would launch another offensive, right? And they had ordered all units to start digging their trenches. And so the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Gorkha Rifles, which he joined as a young second lieutenant, was busy digging trenches and was busy licking their wounds, having suffered very, very heavy losses at the hands of the Chinese. Now, this was the time when the brigade commander of the brigade asked every officer within the brigade to write down his impressions of the 1962 war based on interaction between officers and men, right? And Nanavatty at this time had not yet turned 20. And this is the kind of paper, or this is the kind of analysis that he made of the India-China War of 1962 at the tender age of 19 and a half or 20. And that again, if you are up to it, to listen to it, just a couple of vignettes from that. Nanavatty wrote about the abject lack of preparedness of the Indian army. It was neither the antiquated arms nor the insufficiency of ammunition that everybody seemed to point out and say that's the reason. I agree, he writes. I agree there was probably not enough at the right place and time. But what is this if not fumbling and disorder at the top? A complete lack of foresight and planning. There is no doubt our army was a mere peacetime machine. Physically unfit, ill-equipped and ill-trained, with little or no effort to increase its fighting efficiency, we got what we deserved. Brilliant politicians of the time wanted to do away with the defense services completely. It might have spared us the shame. Now look at this 20-year-old writing an absolute indictment of the army at that particular time. And mind you, responding to these opening paras, the brigade major, a slightly senior and a slightly more mature officer, later the vice chief of army staff, remarked, Rostum, I do not think things were so bad. Don't be so emotional in your writing. Right? Now, he goes on in the paper, as direct as ever, and he says, surely the best way would have been to fight back. Had firm orders to hold out been given, the Gorkha soldier would have obeyed them to the letter. He has done it before and would have done it again. Nanavatty suspected that the abrupt and sudden decision to withdraw would have given rise to fear amounting to hysteria. So, now this is just one page of about 9 or 10 pages that he wrote about every facet of the 1962 war. And that actually reveals how passionate he was about soldiering as such.
Right.
Let me ask you, Prabal, that what does all this mean for you if you were to translate it into some leadership lessons for the new realm you are in, and that's the corporate sector?
Yes. So I think it's a it's a book that needs to be seen through the lens of leadership lessons as well, because that's something that is relevant everywhere, especially so today. We talk about grey zone warfare. General Nanavatty had been leading the action in grey zone warfare for years. We talk about the nebulous environment. We talk about VUCA today. All of this was there. And he set the standards. He set the bar. The way he did it, and there's a point that I would like to make in terms of the fact that, he was often seen, not often, but maybe his critics saw him as somebody who was probably not having or possessing or not focused on the large picture, the big vision. I would think differently. I think and this is also coming from my little interaction that I'd had with him there, and many years later when I see the environment elsewhere, we have a lot of big talk, we have a lot of top-down, conversations and talk that goes on. But General Nanavatty's lens of looking at strategy was grounds up. He chose to focus on the here and now. And the way he looked at it was that, if you have your here and now sorted, and many of these little pictures sorted, would lead to a better, sounder, and a more solid, larger picture.
So he looked. So are you suggesting that he looked at it as some kind of a jigsaw puzzle, bottoms up? You put the pieces and build things bottom up.
Yes, that is one way to look at it. The other thing is that, we talk about people, resources, etc. Where do they all start? They start from the ground. So he would connect with people on the ground. And your book brings it out very well. It talks about how he connected with the troops, how he connected with the young officers, how he connected with his units. Because I think that's where the focus was. And since he connected with people, he brought the best out of them. I must, quote this, that, you write about it in your book. And this is from Rommel's book, and it could well be General Nanavatty. Exasperating to staff officers, he was worshipped by fighting troops, and what he got out of them was beyond rational calculation. This is what they spoke about Rommel. This is what they might even talk about General Nanavatty.
So I'm reminded of an incident here. Now, when he went to Sri Lanka as the commander of the para-commando task force, he was the commander. Now, as the commander, he could have well sat in the headquarters and directed operations as the commander, right? But he chose to, right in the beginning, to see for himself how the para-commandos operated. And he went with them on several operations, taking down notes as he went along to find out what they did right and what could be improved. Now, similarly, this was as a colonel, so you can understand, superbly fit, a marksman of the highest quality. Now, the commandos are probably, General Nanavatty calls him, the para-commando units, as the best infantry units in the Indian Army. Okay, superb in several skills. Now, he matched them skill for skill in Jaffna, and that is why within a matter of a few weeks, he was accepted by the 3 para-commando units. Now, you would imagine that he would go as a divisional commander to Baramulla, and he would direct operations from the divisional headquarters. But like I told you, no, he liked to see, one look was worth 100 reports. But there is an instance wherein he goes for a patrol with a Punjab regiment, a battalion of the Punjab regiment. And he seamlessly slips into the patrol, and suddenly this whole lot of huge Sardars see somebody who doesn't look like them along with them. And now the only people who don't look like the Sardars in a Punjab battalion at that time were the guys who were cooks, barbers, or the other tradesmen. They used to call them tradesmen. So they were talking amongst themselves, "Ye which tradesman ki aaya hamare saath?" So then he had to tell them that, "Look, I'm your GOC and I'm going to be on patrol with you." And so these are the kind of leadership connects that he made with troops that made him acceptable. Now, another interesting about his acceptability to troops. So during my over 100 interviews that I did for the book, I spoke to a group of about 12 to 13 junior commissioned officers. And I asked them that, were any of you intimidated by General Nanavatty? As several of the officers whom I spoke to did tell me that, look, he was a very intimidating personality. Not a single one of those soldiers or JCOs were intimidated by him. Because they said, "Sir, hamari jaan, unki jaan thi." And that was the connect that he made, which I'm sure many, many outstanding military leaders do make. And that's the ethos of the Indian Army. Like an officer, most of the times, or in fact, all the time, has to convey that message that Meri jaan tumhari jaan hai. That's the kind of operational message that they send across.
Yes, and I would like to ask you about something that you spoke of. You showed the letter that he wrote when he was a young officer, and he walked the talk. And he walked the talk as he rose up the ranks. On that letter, I mean, I'm just picking up from that. That if you refer to that incident in Kaluchak, for instance,
Yes.
and I would urge you to talk us through it. And also, you spoke about the Gurkhas, the troops who respected him. There was this incident where 2 Gurkha Johnnies died in the swimming pool. And what did he do? I mean, he got them to become superb swimmers and cross the canal crossing, etc. I mean, that was again kind of legacy he left, a kind of imprint he left upon the troops that they could achieve something far beyond their means, because Gurkhas were not known to be exceptional swimmers, not swimmers at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good swimmers, very far away from that. But he made them swim across the canal. So, can you talk us through it?
Yeah. 2 incidents again spread across almost 20 years. The first one was barely maybe a couple of days after he took over command of his battalion, a Gorkha soldier drowned while carrying out watermanship training, while carrying out training to cross a water obstacle. Now, he took upon himself, of course, the standard court of inquiry followed, and he said that I own responsibility. Nobody else owns responsibility for this accident. I own responsibility. And if anyone is accountable, it's me, not anybody else. And the brigade commander left it at that. But he didn't leave it at that. But General Nanavatty, or Colonel Nanavatty at that time, didn't leave it at that. He took upon himself to ensure that in a matter of months, his battalion would comprise the best water crossing teams and the best swimmers in that brigade. And Gorkhas are not known to be swimmers. The other incident, of course, I'm sure General Nagaraj, who's sitting here, would be very well aware of it, that if those of you would recollect that once Operation Parakram had started, a few months after Operation Parakram, there was this Kaluchak, and the Indian Army was all mobilized. They were ready to go across. They were waiting for political clearance. Then you had the Kaluchak massacre, right? And when the Kaluchak massacre happened, formations in the Indian Army were furious because it was an attack on an army camp. And brigades and divisions were straining at the leash, wanting to go across and teach the Pakistanis a lesson. But that was a time when this whole issue of waiting for political clearance and recognizing the fact that war is nothing but politics by other means. That is none other than Clausewitz who mentioned it. And that one had to ensure that any act of war had to have political legitimacy and cannot be a result of an army commander or a divisional commander taking matters into their own hands and saying that we will give the adversary an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. And that is where his strategic mindset and his ability to look at things through a realist prism also came about.
So I had a question in mind. You spoke about the fact that this was the hardest book to write. Well, it has certainly been the easiest book to read for a reader, and it's a fantastic book. Again, I reiterate. I would like to ask you, when you write a biography, and you spoke about how difficult it was to get him to agree. That is one part of it. The other thing is, what is the distance that you maintain when you're writing about someone who's around, who's living? If I were to write a biography of somebody who's been in the past, say Mahatma Gandhi's biography or somebody else, very hard to write in a certain way. But also, you are also not confronted by the fact that the protagonist is around. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that, you are able to get a lot of information. You said you had made notes, which is again very, makes it easier for you, supposedly. But then you'll also have to use the skills and craft of a writer to put it all together. So given that biography is, and this is also a genre that you have attempted the first time, which is very different from your previous 2 books, how would you, what are the issues you faced? What are the difficulties you faced while writing, as a writer, as a biographer, in terms of the genre, in terms of these other issues? how far is the protagonist from the actual piece of action, and how close? How do you segregate the two, and how do you address some of these, paradoxes that you encounter as a writer?
So one of the things I already mentioned in my presentation, which means to say that you need to have your feet on the ground, and you need to try and avoid getting overwhelmed by the personality of the central protagonist, because obviously the central protagonist is a towering personality, and that's why you decided to write about him, right? The second issue is a more academic and a professional issue regarding writing. I very strongly believe in the process of triangulation. And when I talk about triangulation, I'm talking about triangulating primary sources of information, secondary sources of information, and your own interpretation and analysis. So how did I get my primary sources of information? My primary sources of information comprised his huge, voluminous set of papers, all of which could be corroborated in time and space with other secondary sources. So that you say, look, this guy has written it as it has happened, or he is telling me as it has happened. He's not making it up, or he's not relying on his memory to tell me after all these years. The second part of the triangulation is your ability to connect with several of his contemporaries, seniors and juniors, to try and validate some of the stuff that you've already heard from him. And for this, I must say that again, the meticulous way or meticulous approach to life that General Nanavatty has. So when he gave me his permission, or when he gave me the permission to write the biography, within a week, I had this meticulously tabulated Excel sheet with a list of associates from every tenure that he has served. And he says, Arjun, these are the list of my associates, colleagues, and juniors who have served with me. Please pick and choose who you want to interact with. And I am out of the loop completely. I am not interested in who you speak to, but these are the list of people who I've worked with. You may reach out to them and decide who you want to lose. So from that, I picked out about 80 to 85 people across the years, and engaged with them in multiple ways, either face-to-face interviews or email exchanges or long telephone conversations. What I used to do is that I used to have my MacBook on with the recorder, and I used to have the mobile phone on, and long conversations on WhatsApp, record it, and then I used to transcribe it myself. I didn't use, I had no access to any transcription software. I didn't have a research associate do any of my work of transcription. So I did all those transcriptions myself. And then I used this triangulation process to arrive at the most probable course of event or what happened. So I think that was what I followed in my earlier books too. And I found that worked pretty well here. And I have not received any pushback about factual accuracies about what I have written about, or accuracy of events that I have written about. Personality biases also, I've not received any contrarian opinions, except one odd, which probably, if I may share, that the only thing, and General Nagaraj will be interested in knowing this, that one of the officers whom I spoke to, and I've not included it in the book, but I must share it with all of you. So one of the officers, who was a favorite of General Nanavatty, a battalion commander, tells me that, sir, now in hindsight, mind you, 20 years later, he says, sir, I think General Nanavatty lacked adequate amount of EQ. So then and General Nanavatty was very interested, was fascinated when I told him. I said, sir, I spoke to somebody who you know very well. And he said that, sir, you lack EQ. He thought about it very deliberately. And he says, Arjun, EQ is largely a corporate phenomena. He says, what I think a military leader should possess is empathy. Empathy is one of the core ingredients of EQ as we all know it. But when it comes to the military, particularly in active operations, I think it is empathy which is more important than looking at EQ as a conglomerate of several traits. Right?
Good you brought it out, sir, because the first point I wrote here as one of the things that I should ask you, which you now have sort of tossed the ball back here, I wrote empathy, because I thought that is what the book kind of screamed out aloud. And not just that, From my recollections of 3 decades back, the one thing that impressed us all was his empathy, because he was not there to talk to us or talk at me, but he was there to have a conversation, to hear more. So that, I thought, that was empathy, because empathy is also doing these little things well, and that's what he represented. So one of the things, again, I mean, there was a Nanavati report, Nanavati factor. This was a Nanavati factor which you must talk about to everyone.
So this was another thing. You see, in the armed forces, or for that matter, in any large corporate organization, annual confidential reports or appraisal reports can be objective or they can be subjective, right? Most of us or most organizations attempt to move towards objectivity rather than subjectivity, right? The armed forces are no different. So while the reporting system in the armed forces is designed to be objective, but after all, when we engage with humans, we do descend into subjectivity from time to time. Now, General Nanavatty gathered a reputation in the Indian Army of being one of the toughest assessors that anybody has seen, right? And there have been one of the critics in the book is a former army chief who told me, he says, Arjun, I told Nanavatty to go easy sometimes. But Nanavatty said, I am being objective and I am assessing officers as per the yardsticks that you have laid out. You have the liberty to moderate my assessment. But don't ask me to moderate my assessment. You want to do it, please go ahead and do it. That is within the purview of your authority. But this is how I think an assessment. So, so what the army did was, the army created a thing which is called the Nanavati factor. So they catered for that any report coming from Nanavatty means that it may have to be bumped up by a factor of maybe point, whatever it is, in order to get it so that, so that outstanding officers do not lose out when it comes to promotability and things. So these are the small kind of things. And, when I was speaking to some officers from the Army's MS branch, which is their personnel branch, he was quite high on the list of the assessing blacklist.
So that is shooting straight.
Yeah.
That's how he responded to General VP Malik.
Yes. He said that you as the Chief of Army Staff are well within your authority to contradict me and to assess that my assessment needs to be revised. Please go ahead and do it.
The book has received wonderful reviews. Before we go across to the audience for Q&A, just a little anecdote. So there are several anecdotes there as well. And there's a little anecdote with George Fernandes. Yeah. Wherein, so George Fernandes once, he had a very good memory, elephantine memory. That's what General Nanavatty speaks about and you mentioned in the book. So George Fernandes was the Minister of Defense at that time, and General Nanavatty was in the Northeast. And so he visits him. He says, this name sounds very familiar, Nanavatty. I have encountered this name earlier. Many years ago, in the 1950s, I was protesting. I was doing my union protests and all that as a union leader, and I was physically lifted from the railway tracks and set aside, taken away. This gentleman was in the police. His name was Nanavatty as well. He said, sir, that was my father.
And George Fernandes and General Nanavatty, I've written extensively. George Fernandes waxes and wanes about George Fernandes as the defense minister and writes about his empathy, his connect with troops, his unflagging concentration. He would fly in from Delhi, sit through multiple briefings without dozing off, go to bed late after attending a badakhana with troops, get up early in the morning at 5 a.m., ready for a helicopter trip to Siachen Glacier. So that was George Fernandes for you, and that's been captured fairly well in the book in General Nanavatty's words. So Prabal, I think before we throw the mic to the audience for questions, so we decided that maybe we'll have a small section which is called Voices from the Audience. Right? And we have General Nagaraj here. I know, sir, this has come as a surprise to you, but I think I'll take you by surprise. We have General Nagaraj here, who served as General Nanavatty's MGGS in Northern Command. So maybe with no frills at all, would you care sharing some of your experiences and some of your recollections of General Nanavatty?
Right. Firstly, anybody who has to look at General Nanavatty must read this book. That's a compliment.
Thank you, sir.
But more than that, if anybody has to feel happy about what Arjun has done, it has to be General Nanavatty. Because he has to say it's a good book. Now, I did speak to him. And when the book initially came out and you spoke to me, and I immediately got my copy of the book from, I think, from Amazon. And I spoke to him. The book was on the dining table. And I spoke to him. I said, sir, I've got this book in front of me. And he says, Naga, you must tell me how the hell it is. I said, sir, I've flipped through it. And whatever little I've read, I think it reads very well. And once I go through it in detail, I'm sure I can come back to you with a better opinion of what you are and what you are not. And I have to do that today when I get back after that. So I will be talking to him and telling him exactly. But let me tell you about General Nanavatty. Everything about this Nanavatty factor and all the rest of it, he enjoyed in the armed forces a reputation of being an absolute straightforward person who meant business as far as professionalism was concerned. Period. Now, and I don't want to sound very harsh about the Indian Army, but anybody who wasn't professional enough felt he was a tyrant. I'll put it that way. Felt that he was, a bullshitter of sorts. Well, I carry that reputation too, by the way, of being a heck of a bullshitter in the army. But the fact is, anybody who was professionally sound, who did his job, had no problems working with General Nanavatty. I can guarantee that. I myself, I was commanding 19th Division, and at the end of my 2 years, 7 months of tenure, through hell of all the sorts of, we were actually at war, artillery exchanges throughout my tenure. I was picked up and brought to Udhampur to become the MGGS because more of a warlike scenario was building up and we wanted to do things in a different way. And two things happened in Northern Command. They said, "Kahan phas gaye?" एक तो वैसे ही नानावती उधर है, ऊपर से नागराज भी आ गया. The reputation of being professional was being construed to be a negative factor. Now that I thought was very unfortunate. That should never have happened. And a correct assessment of a person's performance, when I'm putting it down in his performance report, should be accepted as a true revelation of your performance. Quote unquote. Inflation of reports is what brought about this Nanavatty factor, as people are calling it. Because others were pushing up by a notch of 1 or 2 the actual performance of people. What did it mean? It meant that you were you pushing up mediocrity? Is something we have to think about. If I give a 9-pointer out of 9, it means that man is excellent, is outstanding. There's no flaw in him. But if a person who deserves a 7 and is given a 9, whether you want to look at it as pushing him up to meet the environmental requirement is something which one has to be very clear on. Nanavatty would have said 7, and I can guarantee to you he would have made it 7.5 because he had that empathy factor. He was not, he isn't a be-minded person. It wasn't as if he is intentionally trying to put down somebody. No. In all cases, if you were worth 8, he'll make it 8.5. That much I can say. And I had no problem with him. A thorough professional. When we had to plan in the 2 years that I spent there, and the book brings out very clearly what all Northern Command went through. In all our reconnaissance, in all our meetings with down to battalion commander level, the only thing that was being looked at is how professionally correct is the plan that you are making to go across the line and capture an objective or carry out a raid or do something like that. All comments that were made thereafter were only based on two factors. One, make sure you can do what you are planning to do. Tell us what you want to make it happen. That was the type of an approach that we were having throughout. And if that is considered to be, if I say ki yaar, you're supposed to infiltrate through a gap in the enemy lines, which is only 300 meters, and you're going to go through it with 800 bodies, can you do it in the time frame you're talking about without being, what shall I say, detected? These are the type of things that were being questioned when, if this is to be considered as going too much into detail for an army commander, and some people have the audacity or the, I don't know what, to say that he lacked strategic vision or he was not thinking, that's not.
That is primarily an issue.
An opinion.
Yes, it's an opinion.
It's an opinion. I leave it at that. No, I'm not talking about you. I'm saying it's an opinion.
Yes.
There are people who have commented that he lacked A, B, and C. No, very, very clear in what we wanted. It was very clear in how we wanted to go into war. Very clear what was available with us. Very clear what the infrastructure dictated as to how the movement of heavy equipment and artillery and things like that would happen forward, so that we can support more depth once we went in. Let's be very clear, there was no pool faking and all this. And he's a wonderful person. His wife was another wonderful person. And there is no problems with that gentleman. He's a thorough gentleman.
Thank you very much.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.